Welcome, this is Najma Minhas. In what seems to be a series of events from a Bollywood movie, the Indian government is in a stew over the indictment charges for a contracted killer for hire in the United States. After the tit-for-tat imbroglio that was played out with the Canadian government over Hardeep Singh Nijjar, in which the Indian government and the Indian press called absurd allegations from the Canadian government that Indian intelligence was involved. Now it seems that the Indian Intelligence Agency has been caught with its pants down in the United States. Startling revelations started coming out. First with an FT story over a plot involving the murder of a US citizen, Gurbadwant Singh Banun, who is a Sikh activist working for the Khalistan movement, a separate Sikh nation. November the 29th saw indictment charges of Nikhil Gupta, a 52-year-old Indian national and drug trafficker, in a New York court. The charge sheet, a 15-page document, details how he was approached, offered money, said to be around $100,000, by CC1, the unnamed Indian intelligence government official, who gave him contact details among other things for Banun and asked him, in his words, finish him, don't take too much time. Nikhil got caught because he in turn had hired a hitman who turned out to be an undercover DEA agent. He was instructed that the killing had to be done after Modi's visit in June, so that his killing did not become a topic of interest during that visit. Unlike their heavy-handed response to the Canadian government, the Indian government has announced that they will set up a high-level committee to investigate. In the United States, a Foreign Relations Committee hearing on transnational repression brought up the series of events, and the chair, Senator Ben Cardin's opening remarks refer to Indian actions alongside those of Russia and China. Democrat Senator Tim Kaine expressed his displeasure and said, "We often say we are the oldest democracy in the world and India the largest democracy in the world. This is not the behaviour of a respectable democracy." To understand whether this will have any impact on US-India relations, or given the role that India has to play vis-a-vis China to act as a bulwark against the Chinese dragon, I sat down with Michael Kugelman, Director, South Asia Institute, Wilson Center, to understand where the two countries stand. Michael, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Good to be here back with you.
Michael, tell me, last week we had a foreign relations hearing on transnational repression. The initial words were by Senator Cardin, and he spent his whole almost 1-minute speech talking about India. Furthermore, Senator Tim Kaine referred to the fact that he was shocked by these actions and that these were not the actions that he would have expected from a respectable democracy.
We often say we're the oldest democracy in the world and India is the largest democracy in the world. This is not the behavior of a respectable democracy.
How much shock is there in the US over this?
Yeah, I think that there is a lot of maybe shock is not the right word, but a lot of concern, a lot of anxiety. And I think that for so many in Washington, certainly those on Capitol Hill as well as those in the administration, there's a sense of just this wow, this happened to us, because we know that this story of transnational repression, as the technical term is something that happens. A lot of countries do it. India has done it in the past, but the notion of India, a top partner, a strategic partner of the U.S., attempting something like this on U.S. soil, I think it's been a bit of a wake-up call. I think for many in Washington who, for quite some time, have been watching with concern as the Modi government has ramped up repression, so to speak, on Indian soil. But to see that extended transnationally to the point that it becomes transnational repression playing out on U.S. soil, it's a wake-up call, I think, for many U.S. officials, and it's understandable. We know why, right? If you see something playing out in India that looks concerning to you, it's concerning, but it's not something that impacts U.S. interests directly. But then, if you're talking about the possibility of India carrying out or attempting a state-sponsored, attempting an assassination on U.S. soil, obviously that directly impacts U.S. interests. I think that's the reason for the wake-up call, so to speak.
Right. So the wake-up call that you're referring to is more about the fact that the Indians may have done this on U.S. soil or attempted to do this on U.S. soil, rather than the fact that the Indians have done it elsewhere. Because after all, the intelligence community can't be unaware that this can't be the one-off.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, my understanding is that there's good reason to believe that India has carried out these types of activities in Pakistan, and maybe a few other places in South Asia. And I'm sure that
Mm,
the U.S. intelligence community is just as aware of those things as you are, and they probably have a lot more information than you and I do. But
mm,
indeed, it's the fact that it might have happened, not just that it might have happened, that there's a very good chance that
mm,
India tried to do it in the U.S. I mean, as you know, that indictment, the contents of that indictment were extremely detailed. There's a lot of
mm,
information there, and so I think that we're not just talking about the possibility. We're talking about there being a very good chance that India
mm,
attempted this here.
mm. Why do you think Indians didn't take any? I mean, we've been told there have been a series of meetings where the Indians were told about these allegations and the fact that the indictment charges were coming up. Jack Sullivan with Amit Doval. We know that Antony Blinken spoke with the Indian Foreign Minister Jay Shankar, and then finally that Biden also did mention these to Modi at the G20 summit, and yet the Indians didn't do anything. Why do you think they did nothing and they didn't take these seriously? Or do you think they didn't take them seriously?
Well, I would think that we know that the Indians have responded very differently to the U.S. allegations than from the allegations coming from Canada.
Mm,
And I think it's easy to understand why. One is that in the case of Canada, you had the Prime Minister actually, very publicly making these allegations against India, whereas in the U.S. it was always very quietly, privately done using conventional diplomatic channels. Um, I think another factor here is that the U.S. allegations, as I had said before, just have a lot more detail and evidence to them. When it
mm,
comes to the Canada allegations, Prime Minister Trudeau, he basically said, "Well, we have reason to believe that people close to the Indian government may have carried out this assassination," but that's all the evidence that was put out there in the public domain. So I think it's more difficult for India to angrily deny and to shrug off allegations coming from the U.S. than it is from Canada for those reasons. So in terms of how the Indians have responded, you're right. I mean, the Biden administration has known since July about this possible plot. That's a long time ago, and indeed,
mm,
as you noted, there's been a lot of engagements on very high levels, including between Biden and Modi, where the Indians
mm,
were told about this. But my sense is that the Indians have not. They've not denied, they've not angrily rejected what their U.S. interlocutors are telling them. They've been fairly quiet about it, or fairly restrained in their reaction. But I think that now that the indictment is out there, now that it's public, now that it's been unsealed, now that it's out in the public domain, this is when India has to do something. And so India has agreed to do something, one thing, and that's to have their own investigation carried out. The question is, will they follow through in doing the investigation? And will it be done credibly if it's done? And I think the answer to those questions depend on several factors that don't have answers right now. To several questions that
mm,
don't have answers. One is, if first of all, did this really happen? Are the allegations true? If they are true, was this carried out by some rogue operative within the Indian intelligence community,
mm,
or was it something that was signed off on at the uppermost levels of the Indian government? If it was the latter option, then I think that India would be much less likely to want to carry out an investigation, right? I mean, if it signed off on this, it would be investigating itself, which wouldn't make any sense. So, so
But
yeah,
do you think
the
you're
India,
ever going to know the truth of that? They're never going to come out and say to you that this was an Indian government operative. I mean, the expectations are that you'll hear back and you'll hear the Indians saying this was a rogue operative of some type.
I mean, that's what one would assume, indeed, because again, why would India carry out an investigation if
Mm,
the government itself had orchestrated this from the top? But we'll see. It's hard to know at this point, but I don't know what else India could do at this point other than an investigation, while cooperating with a U.S. investigation, as
mm.
well as carrying out their own. Now, in the Canada context, they haven't offered to cooperate with the Canadian investigation. They haven't offered to
Why do
carry
you
out
think
their own
that is?
investigation.
I mean, even Senator Kaine referred to the fact that they were more reasonable with the United States than they were with Canada. With Canada, they said it was absurd. This was domestic politics. They read them the riot act, the Canadians. And yet
Right.
it's clear they know that this was happening, and at the same time they were planning the same thing or even if it was the rogue operative, somebody was planning the same thing in the United States as well. Why would they run a riot act to Canada and not to I mean, of course, not to the United States in a way?
Well, three reasons very briefly, and I think I hit on some of these already. First, India did not take well to Canada making the allegations publicly. I think they found that humiliating. I mean, this is a government in India that rejects any type of external criticism of
Mm.
its policies, even if coming from close friends. So that's one reason why they didn't
Mm.
react well. The second reason is that there wasn't much evidence put out there in the public. So I think it's not like New Delhi had a strong rationale to do anything other than reject. It was easy for India to reject the allegations from Canada because there hadn't really been much evidence put out there. The third reason why India has been, I think, much less forthcoming, much more defiant in responding to the Canadian allegations is that its relationship with Canada is nowhere near as strong and trust based as its relationship with the U.S. is.
Right. Okay. So RAW is known to have conducted operations elsewhere. The fact that they've conducted this on the US soil itself, or the Canadian soil, the Western soil, let's say, do you think this is an embodiment of a different India's self-belief about itself, that they can get away with doing that, whereas previously any operations were kept within their own region?
Yeah, I think there's several factors at play. Yes, I mean it could be for one thing, this being a government that wants to show that it's willing to take all necessary steps, so to speak, to address what it believes to be serious security threats. In other words, sort of a reflection of this idea of Modi's muscular policy, so to speak.
Mm.
Um, it could also be a perception in New Delhi within the government that this threat posed by Khalistan is increasing to the point where India has to act more dramatically. The view from New Delhi, as I understand it, this is the view that's put out there, whether genuine view or simply projected. The view is that we're seeing a resurgence, an increase in activism. Um, Perpetrated by Sikh separatists and Khalistan supporters, higher levels than we've seen in the past, and that suggests that there may be some type of comeback of the Khalistan movement being waged from overseas, from the West, and that the reason why you didn't have India attempting or carrying out these activities in the West before is that they didn't perceive that the threat was strong enough to warrant
Mm.
this type of response to it. But the problem with that argument, I would say, is that even if you agree with that we're seeing a resurgence in this type of activism, to what extent, to the likes of a Panun or Nijar, what type of threat do they really pose to India? Right, they're hundreds of miles away. There's no evidence that they're actively building up some type of insurgency
Right.
or something like that.
And also,
Many
just
Indians
to
disagree.
say that the Khalistani movement is strong now versus, let's say, in the late 1980s or 84, 85 after the operation, it doesn't make sense at all to say that the Indian government would now go out and take this action against international activists.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right. It's all relative. That indeed, even if we're talking about a rising threat, so to speak, given how things were in the 80s or the 70s, especially the 80s and the early 90s, when you had a full-fledged
Mm.
insurgency with significant levels of violence and terrorism, including the infamous Air India attack. This what's happening now couldn't compare to that at all, and we're talking about activism. I think that there's a lot of sensitivity in India about the Khalistan movement on the whole, so there's a tendency to equate mere protest demonstrations, peaceful protest, calls for a referendum on the possibility of a Sikh state. There's a tendency to equate that with terrorist intentions.
Mm.
But again, this is a very sensitive matter given how serious a threat this used to be. But one more point that I would bring up, taking this back to domestic politics in India. I mean, as you know, India has an election in a few months, and so perhaps the Indian government's view would be that, well, if there was ever a time to try to take this bold step to show that they're willing to address these rising threats posed by Khalistan, it would be now.
Mm.
But I'd argue that that could backfire as well, and that we've seen that what's happened or what might have happened in the U.S. has led to a situation where there's some concerns about U.S.-India relations, and U.S.-India relations will be fine. But the fact that you now have hearings taking place on Capitol Hill about
Mm.
transnational repression, which I should say, you led off the discussion with this. The announcement was made by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to have that hearing right after the indictment was unsealed. So it was India that, as I understand, that triggered this desire to hold this hearing, which was not only on India; it focused on a number of countries.
Mm.
The optics of that are not good for India and for the Indian government.
The Intercept put out an article recently in which they took a source from the Pakistani Intelligence Bureau that's suspecting that the Indian RAW has taken action on several Sikh and Islamist and Kashmiri separatists have been killed in Pakistan. One of the names they refer to, Lakbir Singh Roth, just recently died, and he was in that list. But he apparently died from some kind of illness, so it's not confirmed whether he's been murdered or not. But if it is proven, do you think the international community will start viewing India differently? I mean, we know that, for example, this whole incident has been treated very differently had it been Chinese involved in something like this on US soil, or the Russians in 2018 when they did the poisonings in the United Kingdom, for example. The ambassador was sent away. And the international community stood with the United Kingdom. How do you think, if India does more of these kind of killings, how do you think the international community will start viewing India? Do you think it will suffer at all, or the relationship that it has vis-a-vis China is so important for the United States that they will not do anything?
Right. That's a great question. I think that one key data point is what we've already been discussing. I mean, this hearing, the Senate hearing on transnational repression. India was in the same conversation as the countries that you mentioned: Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. Those are not countries that you want to be grouped together with. If you're India, a country that values your relations with the West, so
Mm.
that's perhaps an indication of where things would be going. But that said, I don't think that you're going to see Western capitals and capitals elsewhere, for that matter, change their view on this idea of India being a critical strategic player. I think that, among other things, Western capitals do not base their choice of strategic partners on moral issues, right? I mean, the U.S., for
Mm.
example, many of its close allies now and in the past have not been paragons of democracy and human rights, right? Whether you're
Right.
talking about Israel, Israel or Saudi
Saudi
Arabia,
Arabia.
yeah, or looking back to the Cold War when the U.S. Befriended all of these incredibly repressive far-right dictatorships that opposed communism. That's why the U.S. wanted to work with them. So that's one factor right there. But going back to what I said before, the relationships that the U.S. and other Western governments will have with India, I think, will be intact. The Canada issue is a bit different, just because there have been a lot of issues there for a number of reasons. India's been, has for a long time, has thought that Canada has been especially troublesome in terms of it not being willing to address these perceived Khalistan threats. But Western capitals on the whole, they're going to continue to look at India through a strategic lens, through great
Mm.
competition and so on. But I think that the impact will be sort of in terms of perceptions in Western capitals about India, that it is a country that is willing to take its repression, which, quite frankly, when limited to it being carried out on Indian soil, is not something that's going to worry officials in Washington or elsewhere. But now that they know that India is willing to take that repression, um, across the world, so to speak, onto Canadian soil, perhaps onto U.S. soil, perhaps, that that I think is the concern. And we'll have to see in the weeks ahead. Will there be public pressure on the Biden administration? Will there be pressure from the Hill? Will there be more hearings? If the administration is feeling that kind of pressure to take a stronger stand against India,
Mm.
that could have an effect. Again, it being an election year, or soon it being an election year here in the U.S. But on the whole, I don't think there's so much trust in goodwill built into the U.S. India relationship, and the strategic convergences are so sharp, frankly. I just don't see the relationship being impacted in a big way.
Very interesting article that was written by Daniel Markey. I don't know if you came across it. I think he published it in June, well before any of this came out. India as it is in the foreign affairs. India as it is, Washington and New Delhi share interests, not values. Now, it's an interesting point that he makes, that we're overemphasizing on the values, and actually India doesn't share Western values, and democracy being one of them, and he says that we should actually be focusing on the transactional relationships and not call it the defining relationship of the 21st century, which is how Blinken categorized it in this current administration. Do you think that's a better way to approach the relationship?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I agree with Dan's perspective. And I and others have had similar views as well. So I think that many of us here that study India would take that position. And this is the relationship has been described that way for many years. This is not just a
Mm,
Biden administration thing. I mean, if you
mm,
go back to the early 2000s, looking at the George W. Bush era, and then Obama, Trump
right.
as well, all of the official messaging in the U.S. side talks about world's largest and oldest democracies
And the
working
oldest
together. And
democracy, yep.
I do think that's a mistake. For a variety of reasons. One, indeed, being that the story of democratic backsliding in India is very inconvenient and awkward for Washington, given how it portrays the relationship. And also, India tends to wear that label on its sleeve in the sense that for its own branding purposes, it likes to describe itself as the world's largest democracy. This is not just rhetoric that accompanies official messaging on U.S.-India relations. So the whole thing is very awkward. And indeed, there's so many compelling reasons for the two to work together because of shared interest. China being one of them, but only one of a number of factors. I mean, you look at trade interests. You look at interest in working together because of shared capacities for science and tech development and so on, space cooperation. The diaspora
But
here
that,
is
that,
very.
that actually suggests that actually, because of the fact that we should have a transactional relationship with India and not a strategic one, we shouldn't necessarily share technology or space relations, because you mentioned these, but rather have only that cooperation which is strictly related to China, because that is the only reason why we're having this very deep relationship with India. I mean, do you agree with that thought?
Well, I mean, I think technology transfers and intelligence sharing, that could be part of a transactional relationship. I mean, I think that transactional relationships tend to get a bad rap in the sense that there's very few, from a U.S. government perspective, there are very few strategic partnerships, right?
Mm,
I think that the U.S. tends to have those relationships with its special partners, right? Like Israel and
right.
the UK, Australia, Japan, and so on. So, you have a lot of significant security partnerships. The US
Mm,
has significant security partnerships with many countries that it would not regard as strategic partners. So long as there's sufficient trust in the relationship, and you definitely have that with the US India, even though trust has been affected by these recent
mm,
developments, I think there's nothing wrong with intelligence sharing, and all of that relates to China, right? Or not all of it, but most of that relates to China. The U.S. provides intelligence to India to strengthen its capacity to deter, or prevent Chinese provocations along the line of actual control. Technology transfers, all of that. It's meant to strengthen India's capacity to push back against
mm,
China, and all this talk about strengthening India's capacity to become a semiconductors manufacturer, the critical and emerging technology cooperation. All of that is about trying to drive global supply chains more toward India, away from China, on tech issues. So, yeah, I think it's easy to justify that. But my view, and I think this is in alignment with Dan's view in the article that you mentioned,
mm,
is that it simply doesn't make sense to be using this talk about democracy and shared values as the soundtrack to a relationship that has a lot to offer on so many different levels, so many shared interests. It's just, I think, the rhetoric more than anything else. And when they try to talk about democracy, when the Biden administration quietly brings the issues up with Indian interlocutors, they bring it up,
mm,
they move on to something else. So it's not like the U.S. would have the capacity to influence India's policies in a way that it could ease up on its repressive tactics. That's not going to happen.
Okay, so net, you're saying that the United States cannot do anything which would make India move in a different direction, for example, on repression and transnational repression and so on. And in terms of the backsliding of its democracy as well, if the United States can't do anything, and if the need and the desire for India is so strong because of the counterweight to China, then India can get away with doing anything. Then, I mean, is there anything that the United States can do? It's becoming a relationship which is very similar to Israel. I mean, many people, for example, since currently the Palestine, Hamas and Israel crisis is going on, one of the criticisms that the United States is getting is it can't stop Israel from on any issue, even if it desires to. It can't temper it. So is this the same relationship now that India has with the United States, that the United States cannot temper what is going on in India at all?
Well, I think there's the issue of, can the U.S. do something versus should the U.S. do something? And certainly there are things the U.S. can do, that the U.S. could do. There's sanctions that could be imposed, tariff, trade, punitive measures on the trade front. There are various things that could be done, but they won't be done because of the nature of how this relationship is perceived in Washington as a strategic one. And I agree with that. I think it can be categorized as a strategic partnership. You could have a strategic partnership that's not based on values oriented or morals oriented cooperation. Yeah, I think that there are limits to Washington's leverage, and I think honestly, this relates to a variety of countries, not just India. You talk about you know Bangladesh, for example. There's been a lot of talk about U.S. policy in Bangladesh of late. The U.S. has has imposed visa restriction policies on Bangladesh to try to target those that hinder a free and fair election. Well, those restrictions have been imposed in several cases. We don't know who was targeted by them in Bangladesh, but they've been imposed. And, we're now a few weeks from the election, and, we've seen a significant crackdown on the opposition. We've seen the opposition parties staging violent protests. We've seen the opposition declare that it's not going to participate in the elections. None of that suggests free and fair elections. And clearly, what the U.S. has been trying to do to prevent that has not worked. But I think, in the context of India does get free passes for sure, but it's not just the U.S. It's not just the West that gives India free passes. This is an important thing to highlight. I mean, if you look at the Muslim world, if you look at the Arab world, those countries that one would think would be particularly concerned about what's happening in India, because a lot of the reasons for concern come down to how Hindu nationalism and the Modi government's policies have deleteriously impacted Indian Muslims. Well, India has strengthen its relations with the Middle East in a big way, with the key Arab players, the Saudis, among others.
Right.
These countries don't appear to be that concerned about what's happening in India, with a few rare exceptions. I mean, you will remember some time ago, you had several senior BJP leaders that said several things that insulted the Prophet Muhammad, and there you had some pushback. But these countries, they value their trade opportunities. They see India as a critical market. And they're willing to give India a free pass. That's just how politics. That's how international relations work, right? I mean, we talk about how a bilateral relationship should not be driven by morals and values-based considerations. International relations are not driven by such considerations either, right? They're driven by
Henry
interest.
Kissinger's school of thought.
Right, exactly. Yeah, Kissinger and so many before him as well.
So, Michael, just your final thought. Senator Cardin, who is the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, said he's going to be introducing the International Freedom Protection Act, the aim being to tackle the transnational law repercussions. What are the key elements of this that you think he'll need to introduce to have any impact on any country in terms of transnational repression?
Yeah, so I can't say too much about this because, quite frankly, I don't know that much about it. So I'm only learning about it now for the first time. But I think that U.S. officials, whether we're Washington, whether we're talking about the administration or the legislative branch, I think it's important to keep expectations in check in terms of what extent these types of interventions, so to speak, can actually have on addressing the concerns that you have. We have seen a limited ability on the part of Washington to shape outcomes in some of these
Mm,
countries, not just in India as well. I think that, and not just in terms of human rights issues. I think that Pakistan is such an interesting case study in this regard. For many years, the U.S. officials have thought that they could use aid, assistance, as leverage to compel Pakistan's rulers to do certain things, whether that's to stop supporting certain terrorist groups, or to stop allocating so much power to the military, or whatever the case may be.
mm,
And none of that really worked, quite frankly. So I think that it's important to be humble at the end of the day, especially for
mm,
U.S. officials, to acknowledge that leverage may be a bit overstated. I mean, certainly the U.S. can have leverage in many contexts, and it does, but when it comes to getting other countries to act in ways that would best serve your interests, in ways that you want them to act, even if you have tools, even if you think if
mm,
you have tools, whether carrots or sticks, it's not always going to work out the way you want it to.
mm. Michael, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us today.
Thanks for having me.